The hardest game in the Pokemon series. Big words, I know. But I think after everything we've gone over, we can tackle this challenge. Funnily enough, unlike the last thing we did, which was actually the easiest game, where it was actually a very clear-cut winner, or I guess loser in that case, for which game was the easiest, this was a lot harder to actually determine which one it was, but when it was, well, determined which one it was actually blindingly obvious. So, for the games we are going to be looking at today, they are Pokemon Black and White 2, Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. As we've gone over, each game was harder than both their predecessor and their successor. Well, in the case of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, there was no successor yet, so really all we have to go off is that it was harder than the game that preceded it, which technically does by definition make it harder than the game that came before it. These three games were the apex of difficulty for their portion of the series. And actually a lot of what is applicable to all three of these games underpins the other two as well. But now we really have to see what game really has the edge over the other two. The elements that all three games have, are, well, all of them have very, very well-structured teams. All three games have some of the best compositions. The quality of Pokemon and the specific ones picked just work very well when put into teams alongside many other Pokemon that were selected for the important trainer battles. Again, this is a consistent thing for all three games. The use of items on teams was also very efficient when applicable. And in the case of Ultra and Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl, the use of EV inputs as well as natures into specific team Pokemon compositions really just does a lot. It does wonders for either shoring up maybe the weak link of a team or pumping up the strongest link to an even higher degree. But this is where things get very murky. The peaks and consistency of these games. Most fights in these games have teams of really exceptional caliber. They very rarely upspike into a sudden more difficult battle because most of the game actually is quite difficult in a relative sense. The only time where really a spike happens is a sudden downward spike into easier territory before correcting back to the status quo of returning to difficulty. The weak links of these games, both in terms of actual teams that are of the weak link and the weak links on teams, are almost universally minimal. The peaks and valleys of difficulty are relatively infrequent, so things do tend to stay very, very consistent. But this is where we can actually start to separate out things. And this is where Black and White 2, it starts to fall behind. This game has stellar team composition with regards to species, moves selected, and, well, Pokemon selected. As well as, of course, the item selection is quite top-notch for some cases. Many Pokemon do actually have very good items. But this on its own isn't enough. Yes, they do have items, but the items on their own do not make up as big of a gap. The EV investment as well as natures really weigh a lot more, and while items are good for maybe patching up some things, they only help a relatively small amount. And even then, both Ultra and Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl do themselves use items in a not much higher capacity. They do still have item usage, beyond the standard ace holding a citrus berry. The universally favorable EV spread in natures that really Brilliant Diamond, Shining Pearl, and Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon have, it's just not comparable. So this brings to Alola Mark II versus Sinnoh Mark II. Which one truly was more difficult? That said, both of these games have very, very compelling reasons for one being harder than the other. It is also worth noting, before we go on, that even though Black and White 2 is not as difficult as Ultra Ultra Moon and Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl, all three games are still exceptionally difficult. They are the three of the most difficult games in the entire series. Being easier than, well, pretty much two of the hardest games in the series is not a slight, it's a compliment. Even if it isn't the hardest, it's still a very hard game. The gap between them is very small, as we will be seeing later. Now, let's look at both of these games. Alola with the fantastically strong totems, full EV investment from the very start of the game, many teams having solidly powerful Z moves with fatal moves, few teams of actually poor quality, while having a very large number of battles that need to be fought through. On the other end, Sinnoh has relatively lesser battles in terms of pure numbers, lesser investment from the start of EVs, which gradually will ramp up as the game progresses, high-powered and well-put-together teams with item investment that is very favorable, but as mentioned, a lower total number of battles. Both games hit the extreme end of difficulty. The totem battles are near indomitable with their amazing synergy of their boosts and their ally support effects, and of course their great power in themselves. Necrozma is simply cruel, but this is where a bit of a separation happens. Alola has sort of two plateaus of difficulty. A higher difficulty plateau where many things are rather consistent, and a lower plateau of still difficult but not as difficult. Sort of, here's one difficulty plateau, here's the other. There's a bit of a separation between the two of them, and stay in line with one line or the other. With one band being exceptional strength, the other being still very powerful, but not as overly so. Sinnoh is rather different. It lacks this dichotomy in terms of fight spiking above before returning, or dropping below before also returning. There are not many significant outliers, but rather is a much more consistent line of battles. And when it comes to the higher difficulty step of Ultra's battles, these do step above the Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl Sinnoh battles. They do have a little bit of it above that. But the other battles, which are the easier battles, the easier plateau as we mentioned, is below Sinnoh's difficulty battles. Now, Ultra's more difficult group of battles largely does surpass that of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, with the other battles outside that themselves being surpassed by the much more heavily consistent Sinnoh. This is why this is very, very tricky, as a significant portion of both games is outclassed by the other. So the easier plateau of Alola is outclassed by the battles of Sinnoh almost completely, whereas the higher difficulty plateau of Alola does outpace the difficulty of Sinnoh. So it really comes down to which game has the bigger edge in terms of being higher than the other. And we've actually already answered this question before. But before, this is also a case of quality over quantity. This is one of the two reasons that Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are the harder games. Ultra does have some truly nightmare-inducing fights. The totems are brutal, and Ultra Necrozma is very powerful. But these are only a very small portion of the game's total battles. Consequently, consistency was always going to be the deciding factor between these two games. And even the totems, despite their vast power, they are only a single part of this game's gym equivalence. The Trial Captains and the Kahunas are also part of this. This dilutes down that challenge. Even though, yes, the Kahunas and the Captains do actually have some very good Pokemon, they simply don't have the same caliber of power as the totems do, and they don't have the same caliber of power that the Sinnoh gym teams do. The same also holds true for rivals. The near double to triple number of matches had with these important battles makes these fights matter significantly less, and also means that they need to more consistently keep up. The Elites and the Champion are actually relatively close to one another, but Sinnoh does hold the distinct edge in this case. Yes, Alola has full EV investment unlike Sinnoh initially. It is the combination of Sinnoh's use of the quality of its own Pokemon, as well as the items on Pokemon, that really makes this up. The quality of those Pokemon and the quality of those movesets really gives it a deciding edge. This is what I meant when I answered this question earlier. Black and White 2 had this over the other games. The use of items was fantastic. And Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, for this reason, is actually largely a synthesis of what made Black and White 2 so difficult, combined with what made Ultra Sun and Moon so difficult. The combination of high EVs and the combination of excellent quality items to back that up makes this game such a more difficult edge. This is why many teams, almost towards the end of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, almost are competitive grade, while not truly competitive grade teams, they have many qualities that do make them on par with competitive grade teams. They utilize many excellent strategies. This is what I meant by what was hard to tell, but blindingly obvious. At face value, Sinnoh's battles are dwarfed by Ultra's, but on closer inspection, this was not the case considering the massive diluting effect that the sheer number of battles Ultra actually has on the game. The other part in this is that the battles that Ultra has which are harder than Sinnoh were not significantly higher above Sinnoh. Yes, Ultra Crossman and many of the totems are quite difficult, but they really aren't that much harder than many of the hardest battles within Sinnoh. So those are relatively on par with one another, and because Ultra does have that massive plateau below it, which is significantly larger in terms of number of battles than the higher plateau of more difficult battles, drags down the consistency of Alola. Again, the more difficult battles were the smaller group. It is a distinct separate outlier set that is actually quite sizable compared to the number of battles in the whole game, but it is heavily outweighed by the significantly lower power other teams. In fact, the number of battles that are truly difficult within Alola are almost the same number of similar caliber battles as Sinnoh. Due to the sheer outweighing factor of a number of battles Alola has, they matter so much less. That's why I said it was very clear cut. You add in items, and that just pushed it over the edge. It was a very close match, but again, it was extremely clear cut. Factoring in post-game, they are much more even, however, I will say this. But had the Kahunas and the Trial Captains realistically not been present in the game, it is actually possible that Ultra might have actually beaten out Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl in this game. It is the sheer number of Trial Captain and Kahuna battles that really drag things down. The totems are above Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl's gyms, and even if it is a slight edge, that is still a very solid point in the favor of those games. It's just that the frequency of those 3 Pokemon battles throughout almost the entirety of the game really drags things down. Really, after Olivia is when they start becoming more of a hindrance than a help. And there you have it, conclusively the hardest game in the series. It's amusing that the most recent one is actually the hardest, and the easiest was actually the originals. Again, this goes back to what I said before about really player experience having a massive impact on perception of these games. Not understanding how to play these games early on and then understanding how to play them later on really does give a massively distorted perspective of what games are easier or not. When it comes to these newer games, we know them. We know physical attackers, special attackers, defenders, special defenders, tanks, speeds, walls, items. We know how to do all things. We know to go out of our way to find good TMs and good moves. In the older games, that was not the case. And again, just the level grinding and not understanding the importance of being even leveled really factors into this. You know, it really took cranking these teams up to almost competitive grade to really give players a challenge because they know these games so well. That's really the most telling part of it. That it took putting players who are adepts at the game and have an understanding of how it works to put them against teams of competitive caliber to really give them a challenge. It shows that it was an understanding fundamentally of how the games work that made them so easy in experience. Again, it took some almost outright cruel teams to highlight this, and honestly, I'm glad that this was the case. I'm glad that the case is these games are harder as time has gone on. But as we all know, player individual experience will always count. This is simply an empirical determination of numerics. Player experiences, whichever one is harder in terms of appearance, will always fluctuate between game to game just based on the Pokemon used, the way in which played, and EVs and natures. Because again, this entire thing was done without the consideration of specifically inputting natures and EVs. That will, of course, make things easier. But again, with the consideration of intentionally making things to make the game easier, it kind of diminishes any platform of, well, this game is easy because I went out of my way to make it easier. But again, it did take some pretty cruel battles to smack people out of that. And Yeah, it's kind of strange actually being done with this whole thing. I've been doing this for, almost 2.5 months, and it's kind of all I've been thinking about for that entire time. Maybe we'll do XD Gale of Darkness and Pokemon Coliseum at some point down the road. I'm not sure. I might do something with that at some point, but it'll be a bit more of a difficult thing to actually kind of consider everything because of all the things that are at play there. It'll be a bit more strange to kind of consider everything for that game. I might do it at some point in the future. I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, that remains to be seen. And again, thank you guys for, well, all this. Gotta recharge. See you next time.